If you want the truth about the Imperial Guard, here it is. The luckiest among us are not the ones who survive. The luckiest are the ones who die before they have time to understand what survival really costs. It took me exactly 15 hours after we touched down on Draven Prime to learn that lesson. My name is Adrian Vale, and by then I knew the fundamental truth of life in the Astra Militarum. My life was worth exactly 78 thrones and 42 aquila. The official replacement value of a standard guard issue lasgun, pattern control N36. That was what the Munitorum would spend to replace me. Not my body, not my training, not my memories, not the years that had gone into turning a frightened young man into a soldier, but the weapon in my hands. The lasgun itself was older than I was. The stock was scarred by use and neglect, the metal worn smooth where countless hands had gripped it before mine. 17 sets of initials had been carved into the butt in tiny, stubborn letters. 17 little acts of defiance against oblivion. Every set of initials belonged to a soldier who had carried that weapon before me, and every one of them was probably dead. That realization did not arrive like revelation. It came slowly, sickeningly, leaking into my mind like freezing water through cracks in armor. We were expendable in the most literal sense of the word, not a metaphor, not rhetoric, not the kind of dramatic phrase officers like to use before a battle. It was arithmetic. It was a logistical certainty written into the ledgers of the Departamento Munitorum, where human lives were counted in the same columns as spare parts, ammunition, and field rations. The transport ship Iron Resolve had left the orbit of Vorden, or what was left of Vorden after the 13th Black Crusade, 83 days earlier. Crammed into holds meant for food and equipment were 15,000 recruits of the 717th Vorden Regiment, all of us on our way to our first real campaign. We slept in hammocks hung 3 levels high, with air so thick from sweat and breath that men woke with headaches that lasted the entire day. Training on Vorden had been brutal. 8 months of drills, marches, firing exercises, and indoctrination. They taught us to strip and reassemble a lasgun blindfolded, to march 40 kilometers under full kit, to dig in within minutes, and most importantly, to obey without hesitation. Our instructors were veterans, men whose eyes had seen enough to hollow them out from the inside. They did not spare us the details of what waited ahead. During the voyage out from Vorden, before any of us had smelled a real battlefield, we used to talk in whispers after lights out as if the darkness itself might report us for weakness. Men spoke about what they would do after their first campaign, as though a first campaign naturally implied a second and a third. One wanted to buy a strip of Hab space for his mother. Another wanted to see the oceans of a pleasure world he had only ever seen in devotional prints. One girl from the upper tiers kept saying she was only doing her service long enough to earn a transfer into a logistics office where nobody shot back. We smiled at those plans because every recruit needs some private fiction to carry onto the transport. Nobody mocked them. Even then, some part of us understood that hope, however unrealistic, was another piece of kit. Something you packed because the journey was impossible without it. Half of you will die on the first day, Sergeant Instructor Havoc told us during one of our final lectures before deployment. His tone was calm, as if he were discussing weather, not our future. A quarter of you will die in the first hour, and that does not mean you should panic. It means you need to be quicker, smarter, and more ruthless than the men dying beside you. I remember thinking he was exaggerating. Now, lying in the mud of Draven Prime with artillery screaming overhead, and the wounded crying out behind our lines, I understand that he may have been optimistic. We made planetfall at dawn, or what passed for dawn on that cursed world. The sky was sealed beneath layers of ash-gray cloud, the result of centuries of industrial poisoning and months of constant bombardment. Our Valkyries bucked through turbulence while anti-aircraft fire climbed up from the heretic positions below. In the transport bay beside me sat Private Jonah Reese, a boy from the lower Habs of Vorden whose face was pale beneath his grime and camouflage paint. His hands were clenched so tightly around his lasgun that his knuckles looked bone white. We were not friends. 8 months of training in a sea of shifting recruits had not been long enough for real friendship, but we knew each other well enough to recognize fear in the other. "Do you think it will be as bad as they said?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the engines. I did not answer. I checked my gear for the 100th time instead. Las gun charged, safety engaged, 4 spare power packs fixed to my webbing, combat knife sharpened and strapped to my thigh, 2 fragmentation grenades, 1 smoke. Canteen full, field medkit in place, prayer scroll folded in my breast pocket, where we had been taught it might stop a stray round if the Emperor was willing. Then the Valkyrie shuddered from a hit. The red light over the bay door snapped to yellow. 30 seconds to disembark. The pilot was shouting something over the intercom, but the words vanished beneath the thunder of engines and detonations. The ramp began to lower, spilling in a flood of blinding light and the full noise of the war outside. The first thing I saw when I hit the ground was another Valkyrie burning less than 100 meters from our drop zone. Its wreckage had broken open like a furnace. Black smoke rose into the poisoned sky, and even at that distance I could feel the heat. There were no survivors, no movement, no calls for help. 45 soldiers erased before they ever took a step on enemy soil. "Move, move, move." Sergeant Rourke, our platoon commander, was bellowing the order as he shoved us out of the transport. We ran down the ramp and scattered exactly as we had been taught, sprinting for cover before enemy gunners could fix on us. I ran because my legs obeyed training even while my mind drowned in the overload of sensation. Bullets cracked through the air. Lasfire stuttered like electric thunder. Shells burst with flat, ugly concussions that punched the breath from my chest. The ground was a mess of craters, metal scraps, and shattered concrete. Ahead of me was a trench clawed into the soil and reinforced with sandbags and corrugated sheeting. I threw myself into it hard enough to lose my breath. Jonah landed beside me. Then the others came spilling in. Sergeant Rourke was the last to jump. He dropped into the trench just as a burst of machine gun fire cut through the place his head had been a heartbeat earlier. "Sound off," he shouted. We called out our names and numbers one after another. 38 voices answered out of the 40 who had left the Valkyrie. 2 had not made it to the trench. That was the first lesson Draven Prime taught us. Speed was not enough. Skill was not enough. Luck mattered just as much, and sometimes even luck was not enough. The next hours dissolved into a blur of digging, sprinting from one shell hole to the next, and trading fire with an enemy we could barely see. The heretics, traitors to the Imperium who had sworn themselves to chaos, were dug into the ruins of what had once been a massive industrial complex about a kilometer ahead. Their snipers held us down. Every movement drew precise fire. Private Jonah Reese died at 10:47 local time, exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes after we landed. He raised his head over the parapet 1 fraction of a second too long, trying to find the enemy positions. The round took him cleanly between the eyes. He folded backward into the trench and lay there with his eyes open until the medics dragged him away an hour later. What struck me was not the horror but the banality. There was no slowing of time, no heroic final words, no final look heavy with meaning. One moment he was a person with thoughts, fears, and memories. The next he was a body in the way. By midday our platoon had dropped from 40 to 32. By evening we were down to 27. Casualties arrived in a steady stream. Sniper rounds, artillery fragments, mines, stray bursts that found unarmored flesh. Some men died instantly. Others screamed until Morpheus silenced them, or death did. Night brought a different kind of terror. Darkness on Draven Prime was complete. The sky swallowed even the far glow of distant explosions, leaving only a dull smear on the horizon. We did not dare light anything. Any spark drew incoming fire. Instead we sat in the trench staring into blackness so absolute that every sound became a possible enemy. I was on watch from 2 until 4. Those 2 hours stretched into an eternity. My eyes found movement in every shadow. My ears caught enemies in every whisper of wind. The cold bit through standard issue thermals and into the bone, and I shook so hard I could not tell whether it was from temperature or fear. Beside me sat Private Gideon Pike, one of the few veterans transferred into the regiment to stiffen the line. He had served 12 years, survived 4 major campaigns, and wore the scars to prove it. In the dimness, his face looked peaceful at first glance, but I think it was only exhaustion taken to its limit. "You do not get used to this," he said suddenly, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. His eyes were open, fixed on the sky, not the waiting. Not knowing that at any second a shell could land in your trench and remove you from existence. Some men say it gets easier. They lie. You just learn to function with fear as a permanent companion. When I did not answer, he went on. "Do you know what the hardest part of this work is? It is not the fighting, and it is not even the dying. It is realizing how small you are. Look up there. Even if the clouds were gone and you could see the stars, you would still be looking at a galaxy of billions of worlds. On each of those worlds there are wars like this one, trillions of soldiers fighting and dying, and most of them will never even earn a footnote. We are statistics, Vale. Numbers in reports that some clerk on Terra will read and file away, without thinking twice about the lives hidden inside them." Then he turned his head toward me, and there was something in his eyes that might have been pity or maybe only fatigue. "But that does not make it meaningless," he said. "Even if no one ever knows your name, even if all you become is another line in a casualty ledger, you still stood your ground. You still held the line. That matters, even if only to those of us who were here to see it." His words stayed with me through the rest of my watch and long after. It was a strange comfort, this idea that our insignificance did not cancel the worth of what we did. We were not heroes in the old stories. We were cogs in an unimaginably vast machine, and our value came from doing our part no matter what it cost. At dawn, the war intensified. Command had decided the time had come to drive the heretics out of their defenses, which meant a frontal assault across open ground. They formed us up outside the trenches in ranks that stretched left and right farther than I could see. A commissar moved along the line, a tall figure in black greatcoat and peaked cap, inspiring equal parts resolve and dread. He shouted about duty, sacrifice, and the honor of dying in the Emperor's service. "Today we reclaim this ground in his name," he boomed through a Vox amplifier. "Some of you will fall, that is beyond dispute. But your deaths will not be wasted. Every drop of blood spilled here feeds the soil from which victory will bloom." Then the whistles blew and we advanced. Not at a run, but in the slow, measured pace meant to preserve formation and let our artillery walk its covering fire ahead of us. In theory, mass would crush resistance. In practice, the first ranks went down almost at once when the heretic machine guns opened up. Men 10 meters ahead of me stumbled and folded in ugly jerks as rounds ripped through them. Still, the line kept moving. We stepped over the fallen, not because we were heartless, but because stopping meant dying. The distance to the enemy trench was only 800 meters. It felt like the length of a continent. Every step was a deliberate act against the screaming instinct to drop flat and hide. All around me men shouted battle cries, prayers, curses, and the raw noise of agony. Somewhere near the halfway point I saw Gideon Pike go down. Not a bullet. A fragment from a shell burst, punched into his thigh, and threw him sideways. He curled around the wound, mouth open in a scream I could not hear over the rest of the battlefield. I hesitated. Every lesson of my upbringing urged me to stop and help him. But Sergeant Rourke was there in an instant, grabbing my shoulder and shoving me forward. "Leave him," he shouted into my ear. "Medici will take him. Your job is to reach the line." So I obeyed because there was no real alternative, because stopping meant dying. Because in the end, one man, even a man I had spoken to only hours before, mattered less than the mission. That cold calculation, that readiness to spend the individual for the sake of the whole, was the core of what made the Guard function. We were not irreplaceable. We were powerful precisely because we were replaceable. The final 100 meters were the worst. Once the heretics saw that we would actually reach them, they doubled their fire. Some of them climbed out of the trench to meet us, swinging cleavers and improvised melee weapons. What followed was slaughter at touching distance. I shot a man in a tattered uniform that had once been Imperial before it was defiled with chaos symbols painted in blood. My first shot hit his shoulder and spun him. The second took him in the gut and dropped him to his knees. The third hit his head and ended him. There was no time to process what I had done. Another heretic came at me from the right. I blocked his chopper with the stock of my lasgun, smashed him in the face hard enough to break his nose, and shot him twice in the chest when he fell back. All around me the trench had become a chain of separate, savage struggles. Guardsmen and traitors fought with rifles, knives, entrenching tools, and bare hands. The trench was narrow enough to reduce war to its simplest rule. The faster man lived. The luckier man lived. The other one died. I do not know how long it lasted. Minutes, perhaps, maybe longer. Time stopped meaning anything inside the fight. There was only the endless present of movement, killing, and staying alive for one more heartbeat. When the violence finally eased, the trench was ours. The surviving heretics had fallen back deeper into the complex. We stood among bodies that no longer cared which side had claimed the ground. Our clothes were soaked in blood and mud. Our hands shook from adrenaline and exhaustion. I looked down and saw blood all over my skin. Not mine. I had walked out of that first close fight with little more than scrapes and bruises, but someone else's blood had dried across my hands and wrists. Suddenly my stomach lurched. I turned away and vomited up water and the ration bar I had eaten before dawn. First time Corporal Lena Sorrell asked. She was in her 30s with hard eyes and a scar dragging across her left cheek. She stood beside me wiping her knife on a rag that was already too stained to matter. First time up close, I mean. I nodded because I could not speak. My body was still locked in spasms. It gets easier, she said, and there was no kindness in her voice but no cruelty either, only fact. Not today and not tomorrow. Maybe not next week. But in time you stop seeing faces. They become targets. Obstacles that need removing. That is the only way to keep your mind from breaking. She was right, of course. In the weeks and months that followed on Draven Prime, I killed again. Then again. And again. Somewhere after the second dozen, I stopped counting. Every death grew a little easier to carry. The emotional edge dulled until taking a life began to feel no more remarkable than firing at a silhouette on the training range. But that first one stayed with me. The first time I crossed the line between citizen and sanctioned killer. Even decades later, in quiet moments with my eyes closed, I would still see the startled look on that man's face when the beam took him. Later that day they counted the cost of the assault. Of the 800 guardsmen sent forward, 217 were dead and 341 wounded. Roughly half of the wounded would never return to the line. By the standards of the Imperial Guard, that was considered acceptable. We held the captured trench for 3 days before the next major operation. Those days were filled with the dull machinery of positional warfare. Sentry shifts, fortification repairs, body collection. Burial details taking the tags from the fallen. Short fragments of sleep shattered by random shelling and sniper fire. Food came irregularly. Ration packs full of concentrated calories pressed into tasteless bars and powders that turned into something faintly resembling food once mixed with water. I learned quickly to eat without thinking about taste or texture, treating each meal as no more than fuel for a machine. Water was worse. Purification systems in our sector had been damaged in the fighting, so every liter had to be hauled forward from rear depots. Our ration was strict. 1 liter a day for drinking, cooking, and washing combined. It did not take long for all of us to reek of unwashed bodies, propellant residue, blood, and fear. Sanitation was worse still. The latrines were simply pits dug at the far end of the trench, screened with tarpaulin for the illusion of privacy. Disease spread fast in those conditions. Intestinal infections, skin rot, trench foot for the men whose boots never dried from the standing water at the bottom of the line. The aid station was permanently overflowing. Its medics worked without pause, trying to keep the wounded alive long enough for evacuation. I looked inside once and regretted it at once. Rows of blankets laid out with broken men on them, arms gone, legs amputated, faces burned past recognition. The smell of antiseptic fighting, a losing war against gangrene and decay. One soldier, a private whose name I never learned, reached out and grabbed my ankle as I passed his cot. His eyes were wide with pain or madness, maybe both. "Kill me," he whispered. "Please, just kill me. I cannot do this anymore." A medic hurried over, peeled his hand off me, and pushed something into the line feeding his arm. Within seconds, the man went slack and fell into a chemically forced oblivion. "Get out," the medic told me without even looking up. "If you are not wounded or dying, you have no reason to be here." I obeyed and stepped back into the relative normality of the trench, where death was at least expected. On the fourth day, new orders came down. We were to push deeper into the complex, clearing sector after sector, until the entire industrial zone was back under Imperial control. High Command sounded optimistic. The heretics, supposedly weakened by our earlier success, were expected to collapse quickly. Reality was more complicated. They were retreating, yes, but in a controlled, methodical withdrawal. They left booby traps, mines, tripwires, and buildings rigged to collapse. Every intersection hid an ambush. Every corridor exacted a price before they vanished again into the ruins. By the end of the first week, our platoon was down to 15 effectives. Sergeant Rourke died on the 7th day when he stepped on an anti-personnel mine that tore him apart. Command passed to Corporal Sorrel, who was promoted on the spot by a brief ceremony consisting of a superior officer reading out her new rank and telling her to continue the mission. Sergeant Sorrel was hard but fair. She never wasted words, never offered false comfort, never asked us to do anything she would not do herself. When a likely mined corridor had to be checked, she led. When rations ran short, she ate last. That kind of leadership earned a loyalty no shouted order ever could. On the 10th day, I received my first wound. We were clearing a multi-story administrative building that the heretics had turned into a strongpoint. I was climbing a staircase, lasgun raised, when one of them burst from a doorway above and fired downward with an auto gun. The round punched through my left shoulder, through the muscle and out the back. The pain was instant and blinding, a white flash that erased every other sensation. I stumbled backward onto the stairs and my lasgun slipped from numb fingers. The soldier behind me, Private Silas Quinn, a quiet man from Terra who rarely spoke and never failed, fired over my body and cut the heretic down before he could shoot again. Quinn helped me back downstairs with one arm under my good shoulder, holding me upright while I tried not to black out. The medic treated the wound with ruthless efficiency. Local anesthetic, antiseptic, pressure dressing made from sterilized gauze and tape, antibiotics to stave off infection. The whole process took less than 5 minutes. "You will be back on the line in 2 days, the medic said, already turning to the next casualty. "Keep the arm still. Change the dressing every 8 hours. If you see redness, swelling, or pus, get back here immediately." 2 days. Not weeks, not months, 2 days. That was Imperial Guard medicine. If you could walk and hold a weapon, you were fit to fight. Only the truly critical were evacuated, and many of those died on the way. I spent those 2 days in the relative safety of a dugout used as a holding point for the lightly wounded. There were a dozen others there, all with injuries like mine, painful but not disabling. Bullet wounds, shrapnel cuts, burns. We mostly sat in silence, each man sealed inside his own thoughts. On the second day, a sergeant from another company finally broke the quiet. "Do you know the difference between us and the Space Marines?" He asked no one in particular. His tone was all bitterness. Nobody answered, but he did not need one. A Space Marine takes a wound like this and it becomes an honor mark, proof of valor. They probably pin a medal on him and send him back to a proper med bay on his ship. Us. They slap on a filthy bandage and send us back out to collect another one because there are always more of us. We are statistics, boys. Numbers in a chart some clerk updates every day. He gave a hard, ugly laugh. And maybe that is how it has to be. Because if the Imperium stopped to mourn every dead guardsman, the war would stop, and then all of us would die. His words hung in the air because they were true. We were expendable, and pretending otherwise was a luxury meant for people far from the line. but there was a strange freedom in admitting it. If our individual lives meant so little to the machine, then our private ambitions and private fears meant little too. All that mattered was obeying orders, holding the line, firing when told, and dying when dying became necessary. When I returned to the front after those 2 days, my shoulders still hurt and my range of motion was poor, but I could shoulder a lasgun and fire straight, which was all anyone cared about. The platoon had pushed deeper into the complex while I was gone, taking 3 more city blocks at the cost of 4 dead and 6 wounded. Week after week the campaign blurred into one long chain of nearly identical days. Wake, eat something tasteless, check gear, move through ruins. Shoot at enemies who are trying to kill you. Watch comrades fall, dig in for the night, repeat. By the end of the 3rd week, the composition of the platoon had changed completely. Of the original 40 men who had landed on Draven Prime, only 3 were left. Myself, Silas Quinn, and marksman Lucan Ward, a thin man with an almost supernatural talent for avoiding bullets. Everyone else was dead or wounded badly enough to be sent to the rear. Replacements came from other regiments in a steady stream, each batch as green and frightened as we had once been. I found that I stopped learning their names right away. What was the point when most of them would be dead in days or weeks? I called them by descriptions instead. Tall one, Scar, Kid. Only if they lasted did they earn a name in my mind. Sergeant Sorrel noticed that habit after one especially ugly fight and pulled me aside. "You need to stop that, Vale," she said quietly so the others would not hear. "Stop what?" I asked, though I knew perfectly well. "Treating the new ones like numbers instead of people. I understand the urge, believe me. But the moment you stop seeing them as people, you start making the wrong choices. You stop caring whether a decision keeps them alive or gets them killed for nothing." I wanted to argue that command saw us that way already, so why should I be any different? But something in her eyes stopped me. She was right. The moment I stopped seeing the men around me as human beings was the moment I became no better than the officers in the rear who pushed us around on maps like counters. I made corporal after 9 months of service, when the previous corporal in our platoon was killed by an orc sniper who had somehow appeared in a sector where there were not supposed to be any orcs at all. A year and a half later I made sergeant, when Sorrel herself was mortally wounded during the assault on a fortified bunker. Her death was slow and ugly. Internal injuries too severe to be fixed in the field. She needed a real surgical facility on an orbital station, but I knew, and I think she knew, that she would never make it that far. I held her hand in the Valkyrie while the flight crew prepared for liftoff. "Vale," she rasped. Her face was pale from blood loss even with morphia running into her veins. "Promise me something. Promise me you will remember why we are here. Not for glory, not even for the Imperium, for each other. That is all we really have in the end." She died somewhere between the surface and orbit. Her body was buried in a mass grave on the edge of the war zone along with thousands of others. There was no marker, no service, only a line in a casualty record and a notification sent back to Vorden that would probably arrive years after anyone who knew her was gone. My command of the platoon lasted 2 years and 3 months. In that time, I saw the entire roster turn over 7 times. 384 men passed through my platoon. 219 died. 112 were wounded badly enough to be evacuated. 53 were still with me when the campaign finally reached something that resembled an ending. The heretics were not destroyed in any clean or satisfying way. After 3 years of constant fighting, High Command simply declared the sector stable enough to hand over to the Planetary Defense Forces. We, the survivors of the 717th Vorden, now fewer than 2,000 from the original 15,000, were loaded onto transports and sent to the next war. There was no victory parade, no speeches about heroism, only a silent embarkation onto ships that smelled exactly like the ones that had brought us: sweat, oil, fear. Some men and women cried as Draven Prime shrank in the viewports. Others only stared with hollow eyes, too exhausted to feel anything. Private Quinn sat beside me in the transport bay. Out of everyone who had begun that campaign with me, only he remained. Lucan Ward, the lucky marksman, had met his end in the final week when an artillery round landed directly in the trench where he was standing watch. There had not been much left to identify without his tags. 3 years, Quinn said quietly over the rumble of the engines. 3 years on that Emperor-forsaken rock, and for what? We are still fighting there. Maybe not us personally, but somebody is. The war never really ends on a world like that. He was right. Draven Prime, like thousands of other worlds in the Imperium, existed in a permanent state of conflict. The enemy might change. Heretics, orcs, tyrannids, necrons. The war remained. I found myself remembering the statistic they had given us in training. 15 hours, I said. Quinn frowned. The average life expectancy of a guardsman in a high-intensity combat zone. 15 hours. Remember, I thought they were trying to scare us. I looked around the bay at the survivors from not just my platoon but the whole regiment. Their faces wore the same look I had seen in my own reflection on the rare occasions a mirror was available. Eyes that had seen too much. Lines carved by strain. The posture of people carrying invisible weight. We survived almost 200 times the average, I said. 3 years is roughly 26,000 hours. Statistically, we should have died over and over. Quinn made a sound that could have been a laugh or a sob. Maybe that makes us special. Maybe it just makes us anomalies, I answered. Then I looked at him and added, or maybe just unlucky in a different way. Because look at us, Silas. We are alive, yes. But what is left inside? How much? He did not answer because he did not have to. The young men who had landed on Draven Prime 3 years earlier were as dead as the ones buried in its mass graves. We were only what remained, moving by habit and inertia. Our next destination was Morden Secundus, an imperial world where a Genestealer cult uprising threatened to become a full Tyrannid invasion. They gave us 2 weeks of rest and retraining before deployment, which was the bureaucratic way of saying we were allowed to sleep in real bunks and eat hot food before being thrown back into the grinder. During those 2 weeks, I could not sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw faces. Jonah Reese, killed by a sniper on the first day. Gideon Pike, bleeding out from shrapnel. Anna Vorel, who sang old farm songs under her breath when she thought nobody was listening. Tobias Greer, who told terrible jokes and somehow still made people laugh. Lena Sorrell, who died making me promise to remember why we fought. I started writing their names down. Not officially. Those records already existed in the archives of the Munitorum, where they would be stored for 10,000 years and never read. I mean in a small personal notebook I carried in my breast pocket beside my prayer scroll. Every name got one small detail, one fragment that made the dead person more than a statistic. Jonah Reese feared spiders. Gideon Pike talked about a retirement he would never see. Anna Vorel wanted to go back to the fields of her home world. Tobias Greer told bad jokes. Lena Sorrell cared even when caring hurt most. The list grew quickly, then quicker. Soon it filled page after page, each line a life cut short, a future erased, a family that would never know the truth of how their son or daughter died. It became my ritual, my way of resisting the impersonality of imperial war. As long as I remembered them, they were not entirely gone. Morden Secundus turned out, if anything, to be worse than Draven Prime. Genestealer cultists did not just fight. They swarmed with fanatical devotion, driven by the distant alien will of the Tyrannid hive mind waiting beyond the system. The battles were savage and chaotic, with no clear line between combatant and civilian. I lost more people in the first 2 months on Morden than I had in the first year on Draven. The cultists attacked from within refugee columns. They hid bombs inside children. They brought down entire hive sectors rather than let us take them. Silas Quinn died there, 14 months after our arrival. Not in battle, not by a glorious wound, by infection from a small cut that had not been treated properly. I sat with him in the med tent during his final hours while fever burned him alive from the inside. His body shook with convulsions the medics could not stop. Long way, he rasped during one of his few clear moments, from Vorden to here. Long way. Yes, I said, though I was not even sure he could still feel my hand around his. A very long way. Do you think it matters, he asked. All of this. All of us, do you think anyone will ever know? Do you think anyone will care? I could have lied. I could have offered him the kind of comfort men offer the dying because they cannot bear honesty. But we were past lies by then. We were in that place close to death where only truth still has weight. No, I told him softly. Nobody will know. Nobody will care. We are grains of sand on a beach that stretches across a galaxy. Our service will be written down in archives no one reads. Our names will be forgotten inside a generation. Quinn smiled at that, a tiny, tired movement of the mouth. Good, he whispered. Good. Because if it mattered, if all this pain and all this dying had to mean something grand, it would be too heavy to carry. He died a few minutes later. I closed his eyes and wrote his name in the notebook. Silas Quinn survived 3 years of war only to be killed by infection. The last other survivor from my first day on Draven Prime. For a long time after Quinn died, I kept expecting to hear his voice beside me in the line. That was another cruelty of survival. The mind does not update as quickly as the casualty ledger. You reach for a man who is no longer there. You turn to share some black little joke at the end of a march and remember halfway through the motion that the only other witness to the first years is gone. After his death, the notebook changed in my hands. Until then, it had been a record. After Quinn, it became inheritance. There was no one left from Draven Prime who could correct my memory if it blurred. No one left who would remember Jonah Reese laughing once, only once, when a ration heater exploded in his lap. No one left who had heard Sorrel tell me to keep seeing people instead of numbers. If I forgot, then those moments vanished completely. Years kept going. Morden Secundus did not end by Imperial victory, but by exterminatus. An orbital cleansing that sterilized the world, once it became clear the cult had rooted itself too deeply to be cut out by conventional means. Billions died in that purge, including countless Imperial citizens whose only crime was living on the wrong planet at the wrong time. We, the surviving guardsmen, watched from orbit as the surface turned to a field of molten glass. Nobody said anything. What was there to say? We had spent almost 2 years fighting and dying to hold that world, and in the end it vanished in hours. All that blood, all those names, and the world itself no longer existed. But that was the way of it. Endless guardsmen fought and died on worlds that were eventually lost, abandoned, or destroyed. Our service was not measured in final victories. It was measured in time bought, delay achieved, ground held for one more day so something else could happen somewhere else. We were the shield of humanity, a wall of flesh and stubbornness thrown into the path of everything that wanted the Imperium dead. The next campaign came, and the next, then another. After a while I stopped counting the worlds. I stopped counting the enemies. I stopped counting the burials. My first notebook filled, then a second, then a third, then a fourth. Each new war had its own smell, its own rhythm, its own private language of suffering. Some worlds smelled of wet rust and burning insulation. Others smelled of swamp rot, promethium, or the sweet chemical stench that came when human tissue met plasma. On one frozen moon, the dead froze harder than the bunkers around them, and we had to stack the bodies like timber because the soil could not be dug for graves. On a desert world, the fallen dried where they lay before the Medici teams could even reach them. The scenery changed. The weather changed. The enemy changed. The work never did. Hold, advance, withdraw, regroup, count ammunition, count the wounded, count the dead, then do it all again. Sometimes the replacements came from civilized worlds where recruits still believed in speeches, medals, and the kind of glory picks sold to children. Sometimes they came from feral planets where they knew how to kill before they knew how to read. Sometimes they came from hive depths so brutal that military discipline felt almost gentle by comparison. They arrived with different accents, different prayers, different superstitions, and within a few weeks the war stripped most of that away. Mud made everyone equal. Fear made everyone equal. The first time a shell landed close enough to cover them in somebody else's blood, whatever distinguished them in civilian life ceased to matter. After that, they were simply my people, and I learned the dangerous intimacy of caring for them just enough to lead them well, while knowing full well that many would be dead before the next month was over. I developed habits the way old scars develop tightness. Every morning I checked my sidearm, my lasgun charge, the edge on my knife, and the contents of my med pouch in the same order, even on worlds where half of those things had become irrelevant. Before every assault, I walked the line and looked each squad in the eye, not because I had words that could save them, but because I wanted them to know that I saw them. After every battle, I did the opposite. I walked the field again with slate and stylus and wrote names. Sometimes I had to identify men by tags, sometimes by tattoos, sometimes by some small detail that only command would know, a chipped tooth, a burned scar, a habit of wrapping the left wrist with extra cloth. There were days when I wrote until my fingers cramped so badly I could barely close my hand around a cup. There were also moments of ridiculous humanity that refused to die, even in the middle of ruin. Soldiers gambling with ration chits in a half-collapsed bunker while artillery shook dust from the ceiling. A young trooper asking if I thought the girl he had left behind would wait for him, and both of us pretending the question was not absurd. A squad singing obscene marching songs while carrying ammunition through waist-deep mud. A medic brewing something vaguely resembling tea out of recycled water and leaves stolen from an administratum garden. Those fragments mattered. They did not redeem the war. Nothing could do that. But they proved that the machine never quite succeeded in turning us completely into parts. There was always some stubborn remainder that stayed human. That was why the notebooks kept growing. They were not only lists of the dead. They were proof that the dead had once laughed, complained, envied, hoped, flirted, cheated at cards, missed home, and feared the dark. A line like Private Corin Voss hated the taste of Recaf or Trooper Elsa Mir, always volunteered for night watch because she never slept anyway, might have looked meaningless to anyone else. To me, those details were acts of preservation. If the Imperium insisted on treating them as numbers, then I would remember the things numbers could not hold. I would remember who snored, who sang badly, who polished boots even under artillery fire, because routine was the only thing keeping their hands from shaking. I would remember who wrote letters every chance they got, and who never wrote because there was no one left to write to. 12 years after leaving Vorden, I was promoted to lieutenant, a field commission after my company commander was killed by an Orc rocket. 20 years after departure, I made captain and took command of what remained of the 717th Vorden, a regiment only in name by then, replenished with recruits from dozens of worlds. I became the very kind of man I had once feared I would become, an officer who sent people to their deaths with the same outward emotion he used when filling out supply forms, not because I had stopped caring, but because caring visibly for every single life would have paralyzed me. I still wrote the names down. I still tried to remember the details that made the dead human. But there had to be distance now, a separation between the commander and the man, or else neither of them could function. Scars accumulated the same way the names did. Shrapnel in the thigh on the world called Crimson Comet. A plasma burn across the ribs on Ferox Prime. 3 fingers lost on my left hand to a grenade blast on Mordin. Every scar was a story of death coming close and somehow missing. In my 30th year of service, I met another old soldier, a lieutenant colonel from the Death Corps of Krieg, whose regiment was fighting alongside mine on an industrial world torn apart by mutinous Imperial Guard elements. We shared a ruined building being used as a temporary command post, and in one rare lull he asked me a simple question. "How many years, Captain?" 30, I told him. "And you?" 42, he replied. Then he studied me through the lenses of his rebreather mask. "That is not unusual for my people. We were born for this, trained from childhood, shaped to die well, but you were not born for it. You were just a man drafted into service, and somehow you have lasted 30 years. How?" I thought about that for a long time before I answered. Honestly, I do not know. Luck, maybe, or the lack of it depending on the day. Perhaps the Emperor really does protect, the way the priests claim, or perhaps I am simply too stubborn to die. I paused, then told him the truer answer. I think the real reason is that I stopped trying to survive in the long term. I do not plan for next year. I do not even plan for next month. I plan for the next hour, the next engagement, the next chance to keep as many of my people alive as I can. Somehow, by focusing on their survival, I kept stumbling into my own. The Krieg officer nodded slowly. Interesting. Then he asked the question that had haunted me for decades. After 30 years, after countless comrades dead and notebooks filled with names nobody will remember, is it worth it? The sacrifice, the pain, the endlessness of it. It was the question I had asked myself in muddy trenches, in aid stations, over shallow graves, while shells fell and medics cut tags from the dead. The answer had never been simple. Ask me after any one specific battle and I would probably say no. I told him. In those moments, while the blood is still fresh and the names are still new in the book, it all seems pointless. How could any of us matter next to the scale of the galaxy? Then I think of the world still standing because somebody, somewhere, held the line. I think of the billions of civilians who live out their lives without ever knowing that their existence was paid for by the blood of guardsmen whose names they will never hear. And then I think maybe that is the point. Not glory, not recognition, just keeping the dark back for one more day. He was quiet for a long while. When he finally spoke, there was something almost human in the usual monotone of his voice. "We are the wall," he said, "not celebrated, not decorated, not beautiful, simply the wall that keeps everything else from breaking through." Those words stayed with me long after we went our separate ways. The wall. It was the clearest image for what we were. The Imperial Guard, the nameless billions between the Imperium and every horror trying to tear it apart. We were not the decisive blow. We were the barrier, the delay, the obstruction that let the greater weapons of the Imperium arrive in time. In my 35th year of service, I was wounded badly enough that the medics finally insisted on evacuation. An orc choppa opened my belly from hip to rib during a close-quarter assault. They stapled me back together with surgical metal and synthetic skin, enough to keep me alive, but the damage never truly healed. The pain became constant. My movement never fully returned. In a rare display that might have been mistaken for mercy, the Munitorum offered me an administrative assignment, training recruits in the rear echelons where I could live out the rest of my years in comparative comfort. I refused. Not out of courage. Not even from duty. I refused because the idea of leaving the line, of stepping into safety while men and women I knew were still out there fighting and dying, was unbearable. I was a guardsman. That was no longer merely a profession. It was my shape, my purpose, the structure around which my entire life had calcified. Outside the battlefield, I would have been nothing but an empty shell, a man with no use. So I returned to the front, slower now, dependent on morphia to dull the ache that never really went away, but still there. 40 years after Vorden, the 717th, Vorden only by tradition at that point, was assigned to defend a shrine world called Seraphis 7. It was, by Guard standards, easy work. A garrison posting, patrols, ceremonial details, long stretches without actual combat. My people, many of whom had known nothing but constant war, hardly knew what to do with themselves. Some relaxed and enjoyed the luxury of real beds and fresh food. Others grew restless. I was among the restless. In the evenings, sitting in the quiet officers' quarters and looking out over the peaceful streets of Seraphis, I felt profoundly wrong. Calm was alien. My mind, trained by decades of danger, did not know how to inhabit a place without immediate threat. I woke to alarms that did not exist. I reached for a lasgun that was not beside the bed. I braced for attacks that never came. And in that silence, with no constant struggle to distract me, the full weight of 4 decades of service finally began to settle on my shoulders. The memories returned with doubled force. The faces of everyone who had died under my command. the decisions that had led to deaths that might have been avoided, the times I chose the mission over the man because the mission had demanded it. By then the notebooks filled a small chest, thousands of names, thousands of details. I began reading through them again, reliving every loss. It became an obsession and a ritual. I would sit alone and read the names aloud into an empty room, speaking the details that made each dead soldier real. One evening Father Malach, the regiment chaplain, found me like that, surrounded by open books and murmuring names like a litany. "Captain Vale," he said gently as he entered without waiting for permission. "I am told you missed evening service again." I looked up at him and kept reading. Private Myra Kane dreamed of becoming a painter, killed by sniper fire on Draven Prime. Trooper Jonas Krell collected stones from every world he served on, died of dysentery on Morden Secundus in month 7. Captain Malach interrupted more firmly now. "You need to stop. This ritual is not a cure. You are clinging to the dead instead of serving the living." I closed the notebook in my hand but did not put it away. "Someone has to remember them, Father," I said. "If not me, then who? The departmental records their numbers, not their lives. The priests offer general prayers for the fallen, broad memorials for nameless multitudes. These people gave everything. The least I can do is make sure their names are still spoken somewhere." He sighed and sat on the edge of my desk. "I understand the impulse, Captain. Truly, I do. But you cannot carry every death. You are a commander. You made the decisions you had to make in order to complete the mission and keep as many alive as possible." "Were they not on my hands, though?" I asked quietly. "Jonah Reese died because I did not shout loudly enough for him to get his head down. Anna Vorel died because I sent her to a position I knew was under sniper watch. Gideon Pike bled out because I decided the mission mattered more than stopping to help a wounded man. How many of the names in these books would still be alive if I had chosen differently?" Father Malach sat in silence for a long time. "Perhaps some of them," he admitted at last. "Perhaps many, but perhaps many more would have died if you had chosen otherwise. That is the burden of command. There are no right answers, only answers that are less wrong than the others." Then he leaned forward and lowered his voice. "But here is what I know. The Emperor gave you a gift to survive this long, to see this much. Do not spend it drowning in grief. Use it, teach the young, pass on what you have learned. Make the deaths in these books matter by helping the next generation live longer than the last." His argument had logic, but it missed the center of what I was doing. It was not about absolution. It was not even about guilt. It was about witness. About refusing to let these lives be completely erased by the machinery of imperial war. Still, I did not argue. I nodded, promised to consider his words, and knew even as I said it that nothing would change. The notebooks would remain. The names would still be spoken. The dead would not be abandoned while I had breath. The Seraphis posting lasted 3 years. Then came the orders I both feared and, in some dark part of myself, had been waiting for. A new war. A new enemy. Back to the line. This time it was a Necron awakening on the worlds of Nithrax. Ancient machines rising from beneath the surface, seeking to reclaim what they considered theirs by erasing whoever lived there now. Our orders were simple. Delay them long enough for civilian evacuation and for Space Marine reinforcements to arrive. I knew while we were boarding the transports that many of us would not return. Necrons were in some ways more terrible than Chaos or Tyranids. They did not tire. They did not fear. They did not doubt. They repaired wounds that would kill any living thing. They were war stripped down to pure function. But if the Imperial Guard could not defeat such an enemy outright, we could still delay them. We could still die slowly enough to matter. The campaign on Nithrax lasted 8 months. 8 months of holding lines against an enemy that never hesitated and never truly retreated. We lost ground, retook it, lost it again. Every battle became a cold arithmetic of what we could destroy before they reassembled, and how many of our own we could lose before the line collapsed altogether. I commanded from the front as I always had, refusing the safety of deep command bunkers while my soldiers bled above ground. By then my cane had become a permanent part of my silhouette, but I could still shoot straight, still lead by example. It was on Nithrax that I met a young lieutenant named Ellis Varon. He had only recently been promoted from sergeant after his predecessor died, and after one especially brutal engagement he came to me with the same haunted look I must have once worn. "Sir," he said, "I just sent 20 men on a mission I knew was suicide. We had to plant charges close enough to a Necron monolith to destroy it before they could teleport away. All 20 died, and I gave the order." He looked at me with eyes already overfull with death. "How do you live with that, sir? How do you live knowing your orders kill people?" I saw myself in him, the young version, green, broken, desperate for someone older to tell him that it would become easier. He deserved the truth. "You do not live with it," I told him. "You carry it, every name, every face, every order that sent someone to die. You carry all of it, and no, it does not get lighter. The weight only grows." I took one of the notebooks from my coat and showed him the pages thick with names. "This is only part of them, people who died under my command across 4 decades. Thousands of names, thousands of deaths, and I remember every one of them. That is the burden." Then I shut the book and met his eyes. "But the alternative is worse. Refusing to decide. Refusing to send people because you cannot bear the cost. That is not mercy. That is cowardice that kills even more. If those 20 bought enough time to evacuate 1,000 civilians, then their deaths mattered. If they held the line for one more day, then you made the right choice. You will still feel guilty forever. You will still see them in your sleep. That is the price of leadership. But as long as you remember them as people and not as numbers, as long as the weight makes you care more for the living instead of less, then you will be the kind of officer worth following." Varon nodded slowly, not relieved. That was impossible. But steadier, accepting what command had become for him. He survived Nithrax. I do not know what became of him after our regiments parted, but I hope he kept the names the way I did. In my 45th year of service, my body finally began to fail in earnest. Not all at once and not dramatically. It was a slow collapse, old wounds that never healed properly, organs damaged by decades of toxins and stress, bones weakened by age and too many fractures. The medics gave me 2 years, maybe 3, before I would no longer be physically capable of doing my duty. They offered the administrative post again. Retirement, comfort, a chance to die in a bed instead of a trench. I refused again. "I will die a guardsman," I told them. On the line with a lasgun in my hands, doing the only work I have ever truly known. They did not argue. In the Imperial Guard, a soldier is allowed to choose an honest end. My final campaign came in the 47th year, on a world whose name I did not even bother to learn. It was just another point on a map. Another place that needed guard bodies thrown in front of an approaching disaster. The orders were simple. Hold a mountain pass against an advancing orc horde while civilians completed evacuation through a port city 100 kilometers away. We were told to hold for 3 days. We held for 5. Each of those 5 days had its own shape. The first was confidence, disciplined volleys from prepared positions, and the brief, foolish hope that maybe the pass could actually be held without catastrophe. The second was attrition, the slow understanding that the orc dead did not matter because more of them were always coming, while every guardsman we lost left a real hole in the line. The third day was exhaustion, men firing until the skin of their hands blistered on hot weapon casings. Loaders collapsing asleep against ammunition crates between attacks. Medics cutting uniforms off the wounded in dugouts slick with blood and mud. By the 4th day the air itself felt used up, dense with smoke, promethium, and the metallic taste of spent charge packs. By the 5th we were running on discipline alone, on orders repeated so many times they had replaced thought. And still my soldiers held. That is the part history never understands about the Guard. Not how often we die, but how long ordinary human beings can refuse to break once they decide the line behind them matters more than their own bodies. I watched troopers with split lips and shaking hands reload for comrades whose arms were gone. I watched a Vox operator keep transmitting coordinates after shrapnel took most of his jaw. I watched a squad reduced to 5 people hold an entire switchback in the pass, because none of them wanted the evacuation columns below to hear gunfire getting closer. There were no banners in those moments, no speeches, only stubbornness so pure it became something almost holy. Tens of thousands of orcs came at us in waves, green-skinned savages who knew nothing of fear and nothing of retreat. We dug trenches and gunned pits into the steep sides of the pass, and fired until our last guns overheated in our hands. On the 4th day the line began to break. The orcs smashed through our right flank and surrounded an entire company. The choice in front of me was clear enough: pull back the remaining forces and save what we could, or send reinforcements and risk the whole position trying to rescue the trapped company. I chose a third option. I gathered volunteers, the stubborn, the loyal, and the gloriously foolish, and led them myself. 50 of us went into that counterattack, following an old dying man into what was obviously a suicide mission. We cut our way toward the encircled guardsmen through a mess of lasfire, smoke, and orc blades. The fighting was close enough to see the eyes of the things you killed. When my last gun overheated, my cane became a weapon, its iron tip cracking orc skulls open in desperate arcs. My belly wound from years before tore open under the strain. Pain flooded me so hard it should have dropped me, but adrenaline kept my legs moving. Somehow we reached the trapped company. Somehow we opened a corridor for retreat. Out of 120 guardsmen who had been cut off, 73 made it back through. Out of the 50 volunteers who followed me in, 21 survived to return to the main line. I was not among them. An orc bullet found me while I was covering the withdrawal. Not a dramatic shot to the heart or head. Just an ugly, accidental punch through the lung that made me stumble and then collapse into the mud because my body had finally decided it had carried enough. I remember lying there listening as the battle sounds drifted farther away while my people fell back to the line. Somebody tried to lift me. I heard voices shouting, arguing. I ordered them to leave me over the Vox. The mission mattered more. The evacuation mattered more. One life, even the life of a captain with 47 years of service, was not worth risking the retreat. They obeyed just as I knew they would, because I had trained them well and because they understood war. So I lay there in the dirt while the light dimmed, and my blood sank into the soil beneath me. It was, I realized, a strangely peaceful feeling, not painless, never painless, but clean in a way. I was dying on the line, performing my function to the last, surrounded by soldiers who were continuing the work I had begun so many decades before. The notebooks were still in my breast pocket where they had always been, thick with thousands of names. Soon someone else would find them. Perhaps they would wonder about the obsessive old man who filled them. Perhaps they would throw them away as nonsense. Perhaps, if grace existed, someone would read them and keep those memories alive a little longer. But even if they did not, even if the books were burned, lost, or forgotten, it no longer mattered because I still remembered. In the final narrowing moments of my consciousness, I called them back one by one. Every name, every face, every small detail that had made them human rather than statistical debris in a war ledger. Jonah Rees, who was afraid of spiders. Gideon Pike, who talked about retirement. Anna Vorel, who sang farm songs. Tobias Greer, who told terrible jokes. Lena Sorrell, who cared when caring hurt most. Silas Quinn, who survived 3 years of war only to die from infection. And then the others. Hundreds. Thousands. The list kept going, each name rising in my mind like a prayer, like a final act of refusal against the vast machine that had tried so hard to erase them. My life had once been worth 78 thrones and 42 aquila, the replacement cost of a lasgun. That was what the Munitorum ledger would have said. But in that last moment I knew the truth more clearly than I ever had before. My life was worth no more and no less than any of theirs, and none of them had ever been cheap. None of them had ever belonged in a column beside ammunition and spare parts. They had no price. And when the dark finally closed over me, my last thought was not fear. It was not regret. It was a quiet, almost impossible sense of completion. I had done what I could. I had remembered them. I had held the line.